at the end of verse 7. So if I was writing this, which is a good thing I wasn't, if I was writing this, I would have said, well, he was heard because he was a son of God. Of course, because God can listen to his own son, right? But that's not what it says. It says that he was heard because he was of his godly fear. What does it mean to pray with godly fear? We talked about fear and trembling back there in the psalm. Again, fear being that sense of respect and awe, of wonder of who God is and how holy he is compared to us, who's really just a speck of dust at best, and unclean. So this brings up the question that I really want to tackle here today is, do our prayers really make a difference? You know, theologians argue about that. Some theologians would say, well, whatever's going to happen has already been determined before the foundation of the world, and if we pray about it, if we happen to pray what's going to happen, and it's going to look like an answered prayer. If we don't, well, it wasn't God's will, and prayer is just kind of a formality. Brings up this quote that I've heard a lot of times. Have you ever heard this quote? Prayer does not change God, prayer changes us. I hear that a lot. Is that a true statement or a false statement?
True.
True? True. All right. It's a trick question. Be careful. I hear it a lot. I think C.S. Lewis may have been the first person to say that. I don't know. But I've heard that statement from people I respect, and I've challenged that statement. In fact, when I was last time I was overseas, I heard the chaplain say that, and I pulled him aside. I kind of challenged him. I said, can you find that in the Bible for me? And a week later he came back and said, okay, maybe that's not exactly what I thought. But what we're going to do is we're going to examine that statement in light of several passages in the Old Testament. So we're going to do some flipping back and forth here. But before I do that, I noticed in your bulletin I was reading here during the song time, and this got a great quote here about prayer. I like it. Underline it says, prayer changes things, but even more, prayer changes us. So it's a little bit different than what that says. I think I like what this says a little bit better. And you'll see why. So let's go back to Genesis 18. We were just in Genesis, right? We're talking about Abraham. We're still talking about Abraham. Okay? And there was a city called Sodom. We know what happened to them. Sodom was an evil city that God was about to judge. And the problem was Abraham had some relatives in that city. His nephew Lot was down in that city. So Abraham's going to pray to God. And he's going to pray to God as if his prayers can actually change things. He's going to be pretty bold. He talks to God in ways that I don't know that I always feel comfortable talking to God. But let's look what he says. In verse 22 it says, Then the men turned away from there and went towards Sodom. But Abraham stood before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of the earth do right? Pretty bold prayer. You ever talk to God that way? You better make sure your heart's in the right place if you do. But he's basically challenging God. So I've been to the Middle East enough to know how things are dealt and bought and sold. And I like to go in and see what the price is and making up my mind whether it's worth it or not. So that's not the way it's done in the Middle East. You have to negotiate. They name a price that's way too high. You name a price that's way too low. You talk, and you finally get to the price that you agree on. You have to negotiate. But the trick to it is, both people have to walk away from the negotiation thinking they kind of won. That's a sense of pride, a sense of honor. You have to think that, I got something he didn't really want to give me, whatever. That's kind of the way you have to make him feel. So Abraham is challenging God, saying, okay, I understand this is a wicked city. I understand you're going to judge it, but what about this? Give me something to work with here. God doesn't say, well, who are you, O man, to challenge me? He doesn't say, who are you, O man, to bring this up with me? Instead, he says, basically, yeah, that's a good point. Verse 26, so the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous in the city, then I will spare all the place for their stakes. So God gives a little bit. Now it's Abraham's turn to give a little bit, right? But instead Abraham asked for a little more. He goes, then Abraham answered and said, indeed now I who am but dust and ashes have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were at least 5 less than 50 righteous. Would you destroy the city for lack of 5? I mean, what's only 45? So again, God's kind of like being willing to be dishonored. He's not trying to win this negotiation here. He's given Abraham what he asked for. And so he said, if I find there are 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again, suppose there should be 40 found there. And he said, I will not do it for the sake of 40. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak, suppose 30 should be found there. All right? Because I will not do it for the sake of 30. God keeps giving in. God keeps saying, yeah, that's a good point. And Abraham just keeps asking for more. And he said, indeed now I have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 should be found there. So he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry. I will speak with one more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So the Lord walked away from this, not thinking he won. Which, this is one of the most amazing parts of the Bible, that the Lord is willing to listen to Abraham. The Lord is willing to respond to his prayer. Abraham wasn't going into this thinking, my prayers are just a formality. Abraham was going into thinking, my prayers can change something. This is amazing to me. So it makes me question that. Right? Okay. So that was the first example. I got a few more. And I think these are really amazing. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 17. 1 Kings 17:17. Now we're going to talk about Elijah. Elijah was one of the few miracle workers in the Old Testament. And really the only guys who God used for work miracles were Moses, and then Elijah and Elisha. And you really don't see any more miracles until Jesus shows up in the New Testament. And then the apostles in the book of Acts, and the miracles start to die out to the end of the book of Acts. So Elijah's living in one of those times where God is pouring out his miracles. But he's not doing everything. So he has this encounter with this woman who's helping him out, giving him a spare room. The widow has a son. And a son's a big deal to a widow because the widow had no social security. The son was the only person who was going to take care of her in her old age. So when the son dies, she became hysterical. And we can probably understand where she's coming from. So verse 17 says, now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick. And his sickness was so serious that there was no breath left in him. So she said to Elijah, what have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son? Blaming Elijah. Well, Elijah didn't kill the son, but in her mind, she's just hysterical. She's like, this is my son. I didn't ask you for something. You talked to God and I got one, and now I love him, and now he's going to take care of him, but now he's dead. Why are you doing this to me? She's hysterical. So Elijah doesn't just say, well, whatever happens is going to happen. He turns to prayer. Praying with godly fear. And he said to her, give me your son. So he took him out of her arms and carried him up to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his own bed. Then he cried out to the Lord and said, listen, O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow whom I lodged by killing her son? Now you're supposed to talk to God that way? If you do, you better make sure your heart's in the right place, right? I'm not a prophet. I would not try to do what Elijah's about to do. These kind of miracles are very, very rare, even in the Bible. There's not a whole lot of people being raised from the dead, even in Bible times. So I wouldn't expect it to happen a lot today. But here's what Elijah did. Here's the example for us. He stretched himself out on the child 3 times. He was actually laying on the child's body 3 times and cried to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him. Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. Now again, I've never seen anything like this happen, and this is not one of those miracle sermons where if you pray a certain way, you're going to see all this kind of stuff happen. But I'm showing you that God can respond to our prayers. This all ties back into what in Hebrews where it says Jesus was heard because of his godly fear. I've got a couple more examples. Bear with me. I feel passionately about this. Let's go to 2 Kings 20. 2 Kings 20. Now, many years after Elijah was dead and gone, King Hezekiah, one of the pretty good kings in the Old Testament. There were a lot of bad kings, a few that were pretty good. Hezekiah was one of the better ones. He was about to die, and for whatever reason, he didn't feel like he was ready to die. So chapter 20, verse 1 says, in those days, Hezekiah was sick and near death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, went to him and said to him, thus says the Lord, set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. Then he turned his face toward the wall and prayed to the Lord, saying, remember now, O Lord, I pray, how I have walked before you in truth with a loyal heart and have done what was good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. Sounds like what Jesus did, right?
Yes.
Vehement prayers and tears, right? Wept bitterly. And it happened before Isaiah had gone out into the middle of the court that the word of the Lord came to him, saying, return and tell Hezekiah, the leader of my people, thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer. I have seen your tears. Surely I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of the Lord, and I will add to your days 15 years. And I will deliver you from this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. So God heard his prayer. We're seeing a pattern here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we are seeing a pattern. God responds to our prayers of desperation. And another thing I want to point out in this pattern, you're going to see this with the next example, is they're always praying for God's mercy. God responds better when we're praying for God's mercy. They're never saying, God, strike down my enemies. God, sock it to this person. God, this person needs a little bit of your wrath or your discipline. Those are the kind of prayers that we're seeing God respond to. Abraham said, God, have mercy on the few righteous people that might be there. Oh, by the way, if you go back and read the rest of the story, the city still did get destroyed. But God did send angels down there to get his family out of there. So whether that was because Abraham prayed or not, I don't know. Let the theologians sort that out. But God did respond to that prayer. But in each of these cases, Elijah didn't pray for something bad to happen. He prayed for God's mercy. And even Hezekiah is praying for mercy upon himself. So if we want God to respond to our prayers, we need to make sure our heart's in the right place, and it helps if we're following this pattern. So now let's go back to Exodus 32. This is my last example from the Old Testament. And I have a personal one. So this is Moses. Moses is leading the people. And they're wandering around in the desert for 40 years because they're supposed to go into the promised land. They didn't have the faith. They keep disobeying. They keep not believing. And God finally gets frustrated. In chapter 32 of Exodus, verse 9, it says, and the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make you a great nation. So he's saying, look, Moses, I'm just going to be done with these people. I'm going to take your family, and we're going to start all over. How's that sound? If I was Moses, I'd be like, sounds good to me. I mean, come on now. These people are a constant headache. I mean, let's do this right this time, right? But Moses didn't do that. It says, then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God and said, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak and say, he brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath and relent from this harm to your people. So he's saying, God, look, your name is on the line. If you wipe these people out, the Egyptians are watching. They're going to think you're no better than those gods who, turn on their own people and do all this crazy stuff. Your namesake's on the line. And plus, these are your people, God. Don't do that. It says, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land I have spoken of I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So verse 14 says, so the Lord relented from the harm which he said he would do to his people. Do you believe in a Lord that relents? Sometimes he does. I can't explain it. I'm not a theologian. I'm not going to try to explain it. But sometimes the Lord relents in response to our prayer. So when we see Jesus was offering up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears because he believed God could save him from death. And we know that Jesus did rise from death. I've got one more story. This is my own personal story, the most personal one to me. It goes back a few years ago. The last time I was overseas, I was in Jordan. And the worst part about being deployed oftentimes is when you get bad news from back home. If you find out there's been a family emergency back home and you can't be there, that's kind of sometimes the hardest thing for a soldier. And I got this news that my niece, who was like 11 at the time, she has a lot of, you wouldn't know this by just being around, but she's had a lot of genetic issues and a lot of things going on. But we got the word that her eyes were bad and that she was going to go blind. The doctor said she has about 6 months before her eyes deteriorated. And I know that some blind people live a fulfilled life. I know that God blesses them. I know some blind people who come to like embrace and celebrate their blindness because it's part of who they are. But like, I don't want that for my niece, you know? I don't want to just accept that. And got to thinking, is this God's will? Well, it could be. God's will is different than mine, and God's ways and His knowledge is beyond mine. This could be God's will. But look at Jesus. Jesus didn't go around striking girls with blindness, you know. And He did the opposite. He healed people with blindness. So I got to think, well, maybe this wouldn't necessarily be God's will set in stone. So I decided I'm going to pray about this. And I'm going to pray vehemently. Every morning, every night, I'm on my knees. If I wake up in the middle of the night, I can't sleep, that's what I'm doing. I'm praying. But I'm also a soldier. I got my job to do. I got work to do. I got meetings. I got briefings to give. I got to brief my commander. And I got this, meeting and everything. But I prayed. I prayed. I'm not the only one that was praying. I think I was praying with godly fear. I'm sure there were some vehement cries. I'm sure there were some tears. There may have been some accusations like Abraham, and surely you want to do this, God. That may have come out of my mouth. Maybe, I don't know. But several months later, we got the call. Well, she went to another doctor, and the doctor's like, yeah, her eyes are bad, but they're not getting any worse. She's fine. She's not going blind. A doctor would call that a misdiagnosis. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. That's probably what I would call it if I'm a doctor. I call it an answered prayer. Is that okay for me to call that an answered prayer? And I just saw her last week at Easter. She's doing great. She's doing great. We still have some concerns. So I try to follow this pattern in the Bible, and I pray with what I think is a godly fear, and I pray according to God's mercy, and I pray with the understanding that prayer can change God, or prayer can change things. Doesn't always happen. I prayed for people that got better, who didn't get better. I prayed for marriages to be saved that weren't saved. I prayed for souls to be saved, and that person ended up passing. I don't get it. I don't have some secret formula that's going to make God answer all my prayers the way I want to see them answered. But I do see from the Bible that prayer is a powerful thing. And we pray with that godly fear that Jesus prayed with, knowing that He has the power to move on our behalf. Things can happen. Amen. Amen. I wish I had it all figured out, but actually I'm glad I don't have it figured out. It's probably good that God doesn't answer all our prayers just the way we want to, because then we think that we're in charge, right? And God needs to remind us that we're not in charge, but that's what we would think if we answered them all, right? So, here it is. In verse 8 it says, though He was a son, yet He learned obedience by the things which He suffered. So even though He had the right to be a son, He also was a man, and He had to learn what it feels like to obey. He knew intellectually what it was like to obey, but it wasn't until He became one of us that He learned that. And having been perfected, that means been proven perfect, he passed the test. Satan tested Him for 40 days, and He passed the test. He became the author of eternal salvation to all who obeyed Him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So this priesthood of Jesus goes way back before the priesthood of Aaron. Aaron is just like a small picture of part of it. Of whom we have much to say, I'm going to shift gears here, of whom we have much to say, but it's hard to explain since you have become so dull of hearing. What? Where'd that come from? He's like, I want to talk more about this Melchizedek stuff. I want to go more in depth, but you guys are too dull. Does the preacher say that to his congregation? Now keep in mind, this is not guest speaker Brent saying this to Kirby Avenue Church of God. This is the writer of Hebrews saying this to his audience. Okay, and I'm not saying that to you. That's not my perception. But it might have something to say to all of us as well. We might be too dull of hearing to really get what God has for us. In verse 12, he's going to kind of scold them a little bit. He goes, for though by this time you want to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God. And you have come to need milk and not solid food. He's like, look, you guys should be teachers by now. Is everybody called to be a teacher? Is everybody called to be up here behind the pulpit? No. But is everybody called are parents called to teach their kids? Are we called to teach our neighbors about Christ? Are we called to teach our co-workers about Christ? So are we all called to be teachers in some respect? Yeah, we are, absolutely. It says, by this time you ought to be teachers. You need someone to teach you again. Now, we don't know how long these people have been Christians. Maybe they've been Christians for like 20 years, and all they know is John 3:16. Like, okay, let's move on. Let's build on that, right? But we don't know. He doesn't give us that detail. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age. Okay? So we feed babies, right? I got 2 kids. My youngest is about to turn 10, and my oldest is 13. And they're good eaters, whatever picky with. But I remember when they were babies, it was so much fun feeding them. I had to act like I'm in an airplane coming in, slide it in their mouth, it comes down their chin, scrape it off, slide it back in. And it's fun watching parents do that with their babies. But if they're 10 or 12 years old and they're still eating like that, something's wrong, right? You want to go to the doctor. My kid's not developing as they should, right? And the writer of Hebrews is here saying, look, Christians are expected to grow. It's great that you know John 3:16. That's great. But let's go beyond that. We got to go a little bit deeper. We can't be eating baby food for the rest of our life. God expects us to grow. And if you're not growing, you're missing something. It says, that is, by those who have reasoned of use of their senses, have exercised to discern both good and evil. We're supposed to know the Word so well as believers that we can discern both good and evil. Now, a lot of people, I understand you guys are looking for a pastor in between pastors. A lot of people put their pastor almost in the role of a priest. I'll just ask him what's right and what's wrong. The pastor says it's good, it's good. The pastor says it's evil, whatever. But here he's wanting the people to be able to discern that. It's fine to ask your pastor, that's great, but we should be able to ask each other because we're all growing, we're all eating spiritual food. If we're all growing at the rate we should be, you should be able to ask your pastor a tough question, but he should be able to ask you a tough question too, right? Because we're all growing, that's the way he's saying, I want you all to grow. So he gives this little scolding here about how you're not ready for meat, and then in chapter 6 he proceeds to give the meat. So it's like, you're not ready for this, but I'm going to give it to you anyways. Yeah. It's almost like, it just kind of wakes him up a little bit. Somebody says, you can't handle the truth, your reaction might be, yes I can, give it to me, So he's kind of like provoking them, I think, a little bit to like wake them up saying, yeah, I can handle some meat, give it to me. I'm ready for a steak, give it to me. Because that's what he proceeds to do in the coming chapters. So we covered a lot in this chapter. We're kind of 3 different sections. We're at the idea about Jesus being a priest and how his priesthood goes back beyond just Aaron, but all the way back to Melchizedek, and he's that by him we can come, and he was called by God in that order of Melchizedek. We also kind of transition to what this idea of Jesus praying with godly fear meant, what it means to pray with godly fear, and understanding that our prayers can actually change things if we're praying in accordance with God's mercy and our heart is in the right place, and so on and so forth. But understanding God's the ultimate one who's going to judge whether he answers our prayer or not.
Yes.
And then we transition into this little scolding about how we all need to grow up and be more mature Christians and dig into the Word a little bit to get past the baby food. And that probably applies to all of us a little bit. We all could probably take a little bit from that scolding. So wherever you're at in this story, bring it before the Lord.
Yes.
If you're not really exercising this access you have to God because Jesus is our priest, bring it before the Lord. Say, I have access to God through Jesus. I'm going to use that. If you haven't been praying with godly fear, believing that your prayers can affect, bring it to God and say, that's something I need to start doing. And if you need to grow up a little bit and go a little bit deeper in the Word, then that's for you as well. So I invite you to think about these things and pray about these things as we have our closing song. And if you want to come up to the altar to kind of make it public, that's fine. If you want to pray where you're at, that's fine. We're going to have a